What if the story you heard is only part of what actually happened? This weekend, an alleged security incident connected to a high-profile political event in Washington, D.C., made headlines across the country. At first, the narrative seemed straightforward. A suspect, a threat, a rapid response. Case closed. Right? But within hours, new details started emerging. And now, multiple reports, legal filings, and forensic interpretations are raising serious questions, not conclusions. Questions. Questions about what actually happened. Questions about what evidence shows. And most importantly, questions about why the story appears to be changing. Tonight, we're going to break this down carefully. No assumptions, no exaggeration, just the timeline, the contradictions, and the red flags that are getting harder to ignore. The incident. Let's start with what we think we know. Over the weekend, early reports began circulating about a serious security incident connected to a high-profile political gathering in Washington, D.C. At the center of those reports was a 31-year-old individual from California, identified as Cole Allen. Initial coverage painted a fairly clear picture. A potential armed threat had been detected. Security personnel responded immediately, and the situation was brought under control before it could escalate further. On the surface, it sounded like a textbook example of how modern security systems are supposed to work: fast, coordinated, and decisive. In environments where current or former national leaders are present, there is very little room for hesitation. Protocols are designed for worst-case scenarios. Every movement, every signal, every possible threat is treated with urgency. And based on the early narrative, that system did exactly what it was designed to do. But as more information started coming in, that initial clarity began to fade. Because once investigators, journalists, and legal teams started taking a closer look, the situation didn't appear as straightforward as it first seemed. Details that were initially presented with confidence suddenly started to feel less certain. Timelines became harder to piece together. Descriptions of what actually happened began to vary, and key elements of the incident, including actions taken in those critical moments, were no longer being described in exactly the same way. Now, that doesn't automatically mean something is wrong. In fast-moving situations like this, early reports are often incomplete. Information comes in fragments. Witness accounts can differ. Even official sources may not yet have the full picture. But here's what makes this case stand out. It's not just that new details are emerging. That's normal. It's that some of those details appear to raise questions about the original version of events. And when that happens, it shifts the conversation. Instead of asking, "What happened?" people start asking, "Did we hear the full story?" Because in high-profile incidents, the first narrative often shapes public perception. It sets the tone. It influences how everything that follows is interpreted. So when that narrative begins to show cracks, even small ones, it matters. And that's exactly where we are right now. We're no longer looking at a single clean version of events. We're looking at a situation where multiple perspectives are starting to emerge, and not all of them point in the same direction. Which brings us to the next phase of this story, where those differences become harder to ignore. The first red flag. One of the earliest concerns in this case didn't come from breaking news alerts or social media speculation. It came from somewhere far more significant: the courtroom. Because while public narratives were still forming, something important was already happening behind the scenes, something that legal professionals immediately noticed. In federal criminal cases, there's a well-established legal principle known as Brady material, based on the Supreme Court decision in Brady v. Maryland. In simple terms, it means this: if the government has any evidence that could help the defense, whether it supports innocence, raises doubt, or weakens the prosecution's case, they are legally required to disclose it. Not when it's convenient, not after delays, but in a timely, complete, and transparent manner. This isn't optional. It's a constitutional obligation tied directly to the idea of a fair trial. Now here's where things start to stand out. Very early in this case, a federal magistrate judge issued a formal reminder reinforcing that obligation. At first glance, that might not seem unusual. Judges often reference legal standards as part of routine procedure, but context matters. And according to legal observers, when a judge feels the need to emphasize something this fundamental right at the beginning of a case, it can signal that the court is paying particularly close attention. Because under normal circumstances, prosecutors are already expected to know and follow these rules without being prompted. So when the court steps in early to underline it, it naturally raises a question. Why now? Even more notable was the language used in that reminder. It didn't just restate the rule. It outlined potential consequences if that obligation isn't met. Consequences like evidence being excluded from trial jury instructions being impacted, or in more serious situations, charges being dismissed entirely. In some cases, courts can even consider sanctions. That's strong language. And while it doesn't prove that anything improper has happened, it does indicate that the court wants to make expectations absolutely clear from the outset. Think of it like this. When everything is running smoothly, reminders tend to be quiet and routine. But when a judge goes out of their way to put something on record early, and in firm terms, it can reflect a desire to prevent issues before they arise, or to ensure that nothing is overlooked. And in a case that's already attracting attention, that level of clarity becomes even more important. Because legal proceedings aren't just about what happens in public. They're about process, procedure, and whether every step is handled in a way that upholds the integrity of the system. So while this early courtroom development may not have made major headlines, it represents something meaningful, a signal that, at least from the court's perspective, this is a case where the details matter, and where how those details are handled could shape everything that comes next, which brings us back to that key question. Why emphasize this so early? Because sometimes the earliest signals are the ones worth watching most closely. Access to legal counsel. The next issue in this case is even more serious, because it doesn't just involve conflicting accounts or unclear timelines. It involves a fundamental constitutional right, one that sits at the very core of the justice system. In the United States, every person accused of a crime has the right to speak with their lawyer, not just briefly, not under pressure, but freely and privately. This protection comes from the Sixth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which guarantees that a defendant can receive effective legal assistance. And here's the key word: effective. Because legal representation isn't just about having a lawyer assigned, it's about being able to communicate openly, to share details, ask questions, build a defense, without fear of being overheard or monitored. That confidentiality is essential. Without it, the entire process becomes compromised. Now, according to court filings submitted by the defense team in this case, that standard may not have been met. The filings describe a situation that raises serious concerns. They claim that when attorneys attempted to meet with the defendant, he was physically restrained. Communication was limited in quality and clarity, and most importantly, conversations were not fully private. Instead of a confidential setting, the interaction reportedly took place in conditions where privacy could not be guaranteed. And that's where the issue becomes critical. Because if a defendant cannot speak freely with their legal counsel, then their ability to defend themselves is weakened. It's not just inconvenient, it's a potential violation of constitutional protections. Think about it this way. Imagine trying to explain your side of a complex situation while knowing that others might be listening. You'd hold back. You'd filter what you say, and that hesitation could affect everything that follows. That's exactly why the legal system places so much importance on private attorney-client communication. Now, what happened next is just as important. The defense team filed an emergency motion with the court, and the response was swift. The judge reviewed the request and granted it, ordering that proper, unrestricted legal access be restored. That decision tells us something significant. It suggests that the court saw enough merit in the concerns to take immediate action. Courts don't typically move this quickly unless they believe the issue is serious, and in this case, the priority was clear: ensure that the defendant's right to counsel is fully protected. But even with that correction in place, a key question remains. Why did this situation occur in the first place? Was it a misunderstanding, a procedural breakdown, or something else entirely? At this stage, we don't have all the answers, but what we do know is this. In high-profile cases, every step of the process matters, not just the outcome, but how that outcome is reached. Because when fundamental rights come into question, even briefly, it changes how the entire case is viewed, and it adds another layer of scrutiny moving forward. The forensic dispute. Now we move into the most complex and most controversial part of this story. What actually happened during the incident? Because this is where narratives begin to split. On one side, you have official sources suggesting that the suspect may have discharged a weapon. On the other side, you have independent analysis raising doubts. One detailed review of surveillance footage reportedly found no clear indication that the suspect fired a weapon, multiple shots coming from security personnel, and confusion about the direction and origin of gunfire. Now, let's be clear. Forensic analysis, especially in fast-moving incidents, is complicated. Video can be unclear, audio can be distorted, and early interpretations can change. But here's what makes this situation unusual. Different conclusions are emerging at the same time, not over weeks, not after long investigations, but almost immediately. And when that happens, it creates uncertainty. Ballistics questions. Another major point of confusion involves ballistics. In simple terms, different weapons leave different evidence. A shotgun and a handgun produce very different forensic signatures. That's something investigators can usually determine relatively quickly. But in this case, public statements suggested that conclusions were still unclear, even days later. And at the same time, media reports began citing anonymous sources offering more definitive claims. That contrast is important because it creates a gap between what is officially confirmed and what is being reported unofficially. And when those two don't align, people start asking questions. Contradicting reports. Now we come to what may be the biggest issue of all: conflicting narratives. Some reports suggest the suspect's weapon may have been involved. Others suggest there's no clear evidence supporting that, and still others raise the possibility of misidentification of where shots originated. Now again, this doesn't mean any single version is correct or incorrect. It means the situation is still developing. But from a public perspective, this kind of inconsistency has consequences, because trust depends on clarity, and when the story changes or appears to shift, people notice. The bigger picture. At this point, it's important to zoom out, because this isn't just about one incident. It's about how information is handled during high-stakes situations. In moments like this, information moves fast, narratives form quickly, and corrections often come later. That doesn't automatically mean something is wrong, but it does mean early versions of events are not always final versions, and in this case, we are clearly still in that process. What we know versus what we don't. So let's separate this clearly. What we know. An incident occurred. A suspect was identified. A rapid response took place. Legal proceedings are now underway. What we don't fully know. The exact sequence of events, the confirmed source of all gunfire, the complete forensic findings, and how all available evidence aligns. And that distinction matters, because speculation fills gaps, but facts take time. Final impact. So where does this leave us? Right now, in a moment of uncertainty. Not chaos, not conclusions, but questions. And in situations like this, questions are not a weakness. They're part of the process, because the truth isn't always immediate. Sometimes, it takes time to emerge, and until it does, the most responsible thing we can do is stay informed, stay critical, and stay patient, because in the end, facts don't need force. They stand on their own. If you found this breakdown helpful, subscribe for more deep analysis without the noise, because here, we don't rush the story, we follow it.